Hello, good afternoon, and thank you for joining me for what I hope will be the first of many in a new series of history lectures that I'm making for YouTube. The specific lecture series will look at Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, and it will run from Germany's defeat in the First World War up until the 1950s. With that in mind, this episode does not begin with Hitler's seizure of power in 1933, but instead with the Weimar Republic, the precursor to Nazi Germany. Much of the information found in this video is sourced from Jane Kaplan's 2008 edited volume, Nazi Germany, specifically the first two chapters featuring contributions by Richard Evans and Peter Fritsche. I recommend this book for anyone interested in the topic of Nazi Germany, and I will leave a link in the description below. So, let's begin with the basics. The Weimar Republic is the name we use to refer to the short-lived German democratic state that emerged following the 1918 German Revolution and is widely considered to have ended with Hitler's seizure of power in January of 1933. Before 1918, Germany is ruled under an imperial system with a Kaiser, or emperor, at the helm. Between 1914 and 1918, the country engages in a two-front war during the First World War, and as the war years go on, the situation in Germany becomes increasingly desperate as supplies run low and the casualties on the front become horrific. Following the defeat of an offensive in the summer of 1918 and a counterattack by the Western Allies, the German people have had enough, and there are widespread strikes, demonstrations and uprisings against the government. The new government put in place after the Kaiser signs the armistice agreement with the Allies, thus bringing the First World War to an end, but incurring the wrath of millions of Germans. We see this idea that the German armed forces were never defeated in World War I, but rather were betrayed by a stab in the back at home, and this idea casts a shadow across the entirety of Weimar era democracy. We cannot understand Nazi Germany without examining the Nazis' formative years and the state they fought so hard to destroy. In particular, in this episode, we're going to examine the Weimar period to understand the ideology of the Nazis and their members and voters, looking at how this ideology emerged from the chaos of the world around it. Now, Richard Evans identifies two strands of Nazi ideology present in the party from its founding: anti-Semitism and the drive for Lebensraum, or living room. Let us look at both in turn. The roots of Weimar-era anti-Semitism can be found in the scientific racism of the late 19th century. Whereas traditionally Jews were persecuted, not only in Germany but throughout Europe, by the late 1800s the idea began to emerge that even conversion to Christianity was not enough to stop a Jewish person from being Jewish. Once a Jew, always a Jew. This development was linked to the growth of the colonial empires of Britain and France. In the colonies, racial mixing between colonialists and occupied people was frowned upon, and thus racial ideas sprung up calling for the separation of races between white and black. This began to be applied in Europe too, with racial theorists such as Wilhelm Marr, who created the term anti-Semitism, popularising the idea that the Jews were a distinct racial people who, if they were to mix with Germans, would inevitably decrease the quality of the German racial stock. Now, in Imperial Germany, anti-Semitism remained a fringe ideology. Anti-Semitic parties performed poorly at electoral polls, but they did have a far greater impact in infiltrating the public's consciousness, and we see anti-Semitism in popular works of history and literature. This is relevant for the Weimar period, as Germans, including Hitler, saw the Jews responsible for the stab in the back that had defeated them during the war, and they used this pre-war literature to justify the idea that the Jews were inevitably a problematic group. We first see anti-Semitism move into the mainstream of political culture, with anti-Semitic groups springing up all over Germany, especially in Munich. Jewish became a catchphrase for everything bad. Modern art was Jewish. Feminism was Jewish. Now, this obsession with combating Jewish tendencies in society is twinned with a wider societal concern about degeneracy and weakness, as well as hygiene. There was an idea that Germany's best and brightest had died in the trenches in World War I, leaving only the weakest behind. So we see attacks on Germans with PTSD as an example of this. The idea that the racial stock, once again that term, had been weakened. Now this was to lay the groundwork for the Nazis' later racial hygiene discrimination laws. As for Lebensraum, this had its own roots in settler colonialism. So the idea here was that the German race needed a large agricultural empire to compete with the British, French, American and Russian empires. This land was to be taken from the undeserving peoples of the East, who had done little with it. So the idea that the Poles had not treated, or the Russians, the Slavs, had not treated the land to the degree that the Germans could, so they didn't, therefore, deserve it, as the Germans did. Before World War I, this idea is married to the German hyper-nationalism and rampant Russophobia in society, which occurs across the political spectrum, so not only right-wing groups but social democrats want a war against Russia. For Germans who would reject the modernity of Weimar, once again, the modern art, the feminism, Lebensraum promised a means to return to the rural ideal of a supposed wholesome agricultural past. And these ideas were very popular. In his chapter, Peter Fritzsche argues that the Nazis represent just one part of a wider, broad nationalist uprising that occurred in the 1920s. He talks of a latent civil war atmosphere that pitted socialists and republicans against nationalists across Germany. So as we'll discuss in the next episode, the German Revolution, which overthrew the Kaiser in 1918, mobilised many Germans politically for the very first time. These newly mobilised Germans included radical nationalists, and their policy platform of these nationalists differed markedly from that of the pre-1914 nationalists. Despite the fact they venerated imperial heroes such as Ludendorff and Hindenburg, the new nationalists embraced radical theories of racial and cultural regeneration, which would have been unrecognisable to the old nationalists of the imperial period. There are hundreds of these nationalist groups that emerge in 1918-1919, and the only thing tying them together was opposition to socialism, the revolution, the Treaty of Versailles, as well as their obsession with this idea of national regeneration. The Nazis would later be able to bring all of these disparate groups together under their banner. Speaking of banner, the grassroots nationalist groups identified themselves by continuing to fly the black, white, red imperial flag and rejecting the black, red and gold flag of German democracy. They continued to take part in nationalist festivities such as German Day, which were a precursor to the later Nuremberg rallies of the National Socialists. Key element to these national groups was veterans organisations, the most famous being the Stahlhelm or Steel Helmets. These veterans organisations proudly paraded in German city centres, displaying their medals to onlookers, and they often embraced the idea of a stab in the back by Democrats, Socialists and Jews. On the electoral front, the German Nationalist Party, the DNVP, win impressive electoral results in 1928, and even before the Great Depression and the subsequent rise of the Nazi Party, the mainstream liberal parties are steadily losing votes and influence in the German parliament, the Reichstag. So we can see how this heady brew of nationalist organisations, this nationalist milieu, existed in 1920s Weimar. This group opposed the 1918 revolution. It opposed modernity, and many who belonged to it would become Nazi Party members, or at least Nazi Party sympathisers, helping to pave the way for Hitler's seizure of power. And in the next episode, we're going to discuss the specifics of Hitler's own post-war activism. We're going to look at his early involvement in the politics of 1919 Bavaria up to the mid-1920s, and ask how it was possible that he was able to grow and then keep the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party, going, even during its years of relative ambiguity. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.